Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Herbst. I am president of American Jewish University in Los Angeles, and I'd like to welcome you to a special program on hate and the rise of anti-Semitism with Jonathan Greenblatt, National Director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Since the start of the pandemic in March of last year, American Jewish University has presented over 200 programs on our Bayachad Together Spirited by AJU platform to entertain, inform, and educate you. We're grateful for the more than 90,000 people who have registered for these programs from every state in the United States and from 45 countries. Thank you so much for joining us. California and the United States will hopefully be returning to some form of normalcy in the near future, and will certainly be returning to in-person programming at AJU. However, we will not be giving up this very significant digital platform that we've developed. We hope that you'll visit our website, www.aju.edu often to see what programs are coming up and register for them. We think you'll find that over the next few months, we'll have an enticing series of programs, and we welcome you, the audience. Today, it's a very special pleasure to welcome Jonathan Greenblatt, the 6th CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, to the program to speak on the unfortunately very timely issue of the rise of anti-Semitism. Jonathan, I know there's a lot to talk about. The audience will have a chance to ask their own questions. I want to therefore skip your very impressive biography and just go immediately to the issue of the day, given that Jews are being beaten in the streets. How do you understand the current surge of anti-Semitism and the dynamics behind it?
So first of all, let me just say thank you, Jeffrey, for this kind of opportunity to be with you on this platform and with all of the people who are watching, whether they're watching from home or from work, from their phones. You know, I know AJU for many years as a former Angelino, and I've attended programs there at the beautiful campus up in Bel Air. And I think it's really amazing how through Zoom and technology, you're able to extend that campus and open it up to people around the world. So Yasher Koach on that. And again, just thank you for having me. And I'll also just credit my friend, Brad Artson, who I think is still involved with the institution, whose kind of counsel and wisdom has served me in good stead for many years. And you're lucky to have him on staff. So look, I think let's step back to try to understand this moment and put it in some perspective. So number one, we're living in a moment right now in these United States, whereas we've said at ADL before, we have seen in recent years the normalization of anti-Semitism. So look, I'm not breaking any news when I say that in the last 5 years, the numbers have simply increased dramatically. When I say increased dramatically, ADL, we describe ourselves as the oldest anti-hate organization in the world. We've been fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry for more than 100 years, since our founding in 1913. We've been tracking anti-Semitic incidents for more than 40 years. We've been doing that through our network of field offices. We have 25 offices on the ground in Los Angeles, in communities all over the country, that act as almost a retail operation. And I'm going to, for a moment, just extol the virtues of our office there in Los Angeles. It's one of our oldest offices. It's right on Santa Monica Boulevard. I'm sure many of your LA participants have seen it. And Jeffrey Abrams, who runs that office, is really a seasoned professional. And he and that LA office, which again have been on the front line of fighting different kinds of hate for years. We run the LA Against Hate Coalition, or the primary organizers behind it, have done so much work with other communities. But that office on the ground in Los Angeles is the front line in responding to hate when it happens. Acts of harassment or vandalism or violence. When they come in, Jeffrey, we track those things. And to elaborate, look, felonies and misdemeanors, like an act of vandalism is a misdemeanor, an assault is a felony. LAPD and law enforcement tracks those. We're not only measuring that, we also look at acts of harassment, where a Jewish person might be, screamed at on a street corner because they're wearing garb that identifies them as an observant Jew, or where a child might be bullied at school. The police won't follow up on that, but we do. Every incident that we report, we indeed investigate. So we double check all of our data. And we don't think every criticism of Israel, for example, is necessarily anti-Semitic. It just isn't. So we are very, I think, discerning and very precise in how we put out the data. And the data doesn't lie. After almost 15 years of declining, since 2001, which was a very bad year around the World Trade Center bombing, in 2016, the number jumped 34%, year over year. All, by the way, weighted to the second half of the year. You can remember what happened in the second half of 2016. In 2017, the number spiked 57%, the largest single year increase we've ever seen. In 2018, while the total dipped 5%, 2018 brought us the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue, the most violent anti-Semitic act in American history. 11 people gunned down in the synagogue where they prayed. And then in 2019, the number climbed again, 12%, and it was the largest single year on record. 2,100 and some odd incidents, 2,104, I think. So we expected the number to decrease in 2020 because the world closed up in 2020, right? Because of COVID-19. We were all at home. Social distancing from friends and family, telecommuting to our offices, distance learning to our schools and our campuses. So we expected a very down year. In fact, while the number did drop 4%, it was still the third highest total we've ever seen. So again, I think we need to just understand this moment to realize the context we're in. Anti-Semitism, which was like that, is now like this. There's kind of a new normal, and it's a step change from where we were just a few years ago. Secondly, if we try to look at what's propelling this trend of increased anti-Semitism, I think in part, it's the result of, if you will, kind of the emboldenment of extremists. The fact of the matter is, when leaders fail to lead, not just wink and nod at white supremacists, as the previous president did, but literally simply dismiss or discount or ignore acts of hate, it creates a vacuum that extremists leap in to fill. And this happened, we saw the far right emboldened and expanded and really energized in the last few years. And again, in part because at the highest level, this night wasn't being called out. It was kind of being dismissed, sometimes even, implicitly encouraged. Like, hey, stand back and stand by, as the candidate told the moderator at that first presidential debate last October. And yet, we need to recognize that neither side of the spectrum has a monopoly on morality. Many of you people might be watching, might self-identify as Democrats, say, yeah, that Trump was bad. But prejudice doesn't have a political affiliation. It can show up anywhere. And the fact of the matter is, if I think about some of the high-profile incidents that we've seen in the past few weeks, like the assault on La Cienega Boulevard, where a convoy of cars driving up this, for those of your viewers who are not from LA and not familiar with it, this very large thoroughfare in Los Angeles that runs north-south, commercial area, and again, right off a Jewish neighborhood. They drove up La Cienega in a convoy, and the men with megaphones in the cars, they were yelling things like, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and yelling things like Allahu Akbar and other kind of things. And they weren't wearing MAGA hats, right? They weren't waving Trump 2024 flags. They were waving Palestinian flags. Now, does that mean that every person who supports, a Palestinian state or Palestinian nationalism is an anti-Semite? Far from it. And if you're looking for someone who supports a Palestinian nationalism, you can look at me, because I believe in a two-state solution. And I believe that the Palestinian people need dignity and equality, like Israel needs safety and security. Start right here. But there's no question that when you make unhinged allegations or baseless claims or conspiratorial suggestions, like that Israel is systematically slaughtering children in Gaza, or that Israel is committing genocide, things that are not only patently untrue, they're slanderous. like unhinged people will be motivated by unhinged claims. And that's what's happened here. The failure of leaders to call that out, I believe, has contributed to an environment. It's conditioned the environment to these kinds of actions. And to build upon that, it's not just like, oh, well, yeah, that's the squad in Congress. I hear that a lot. From elected officials to corporate chieftains to university presidents to community activists to civil rights leaders, you should be willing to call out anti-Semitism without conditions or qualifications, full stop. You should be able to say, assaulting people who are Jewish is wrong, period. End of sentence, end of statement. You shouldn't have to somehow, qualify that statement by talking about the Middle East peace process. I'm sorry, I deeply disagree with that. Now, I have stood up for our Muslim brothers and sisters when the previous president intimated he would create a registry, when he tried to prevent them from immigrating to this country, when he's just done his stereotyping. That was wrong. And Islamophobia is a problem, and we need to deal with it. And xenophobia against any community or racism is wrong. But anti-Jewish hate needs to be treated with the same clarity of purpose and the same courage of our convictions that we bring to the fight against other forms of bigotry. And when that hasn't happened, Jeff, I think it creates the environment in which these kinds of acts, if not outright condemned, at least people are like, oh, well, you know what? Yeah, Zionism is Nazism. So I have a right to act against the Nazis. But the kids who were assaulted in Los Angeles, the man who was beaten and brutalized in Times Square, the family that was harassed in Florida, the synagogues that were vandalized in Utah and Nevada, all over the country. Nobody asked them for their position on the peace process. Nobody said, talk to me about your degree of Zionism. The linkage was Zionists are Jews, and therefore it's open season. And I think it's really, really deeply problematic, and it needs to stop, full period.
Jonathan, thanks for that survey. And I should note that we'll be taking questions from the audience. Please begin to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Jonathan, one of the things that many people have noticed is that the popular response to the sudden uptick, the further uptick, you would say, in anti-Semitism, seems to be treated differently than a response to other moments of hatred and racism in the United States in the recent past, especially by the left. So let me read you a few sentences from a recent column by Bret Stephens.
Yeah.
But if there's been a massive online campaign of progressive allyship with Jews, I've missed it. If corporate executives have sent out workplace memos expressing concern for the safety of Jewish employees, I've missed it. If academic associations have issued public letters denouncing the use of anti-Semitic tropes by pro-Palestinian activists, I've missed it. It's a curious silence. In the land of inclusiveness, Jews are denied inclusion. So that argument is a little different. It's an argument not that leaders are missing prejudice and hate, it's that leaders are missing this particular prejudice.
Well, I would concur with what Bret is saying in essence. I mean, I don't think it's a one-for-one correspondence, but let me draw an analogy that again builds upon a point that Bret is making. We've seen at ADL in the past year and a half, we've seen the rise of anti-Asian hate, where members of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, the AAPI community, after really last January, when reports started to come to the US about the COVID-19 virus that had been discovered in Wuhan and in China, we started to see the president and people in the White House call it like the Kung flu or the China virus, or to say it was a bioweapon engineered by China to hurt the US and so on and so forth. By the way, this traveled wide and far in QAnon circles. I hate to give them any oxygen, but it's true. And as we saw the temperature rise, and we and others said, leaders, you need to call this out. And they didn't do so. We started to see then a spike in anti-Asian hate, which really metastasized this year in the first quarter with a series of just brutal assaults in broad daylight on elderly Asian Americans kind of culminated with the shooting in Atlanta, where a man went into 2 massage parlors and gunned down Asian American women in a way that was really revolting. And there was a huge and appropriate moral, like just people were indignant about what happened and angry. And the broad and wide, people said, we stand with the Asian American community, which was important and great. And in fact, ADL incubated a new organization, the Asian American Foundation, that was created to help support the community. And in fact, the Asian American Foundation has raised an incremental $1.1 billion for AAPI causes, which is terrific because the community is chronically undersupported through philanthropy. But I can tell you this, people didn't say, I'm enraged by what China is doing to its Uyghur minority. I'm angry about how China has handled Hong Kong, the democracy protests. I'm upset by the surveillance state that represses Chinese citizens. But don't assault Asian Americans. No, they simply said AAPI hate is wrong. Hashtag stop AAPI hate, they said, which was appropriate. They didn't say stop AAPI hate and stand up for the Uyghurs at the same time. They didn't do that. They said stop the hate now. And look, there are a lot of people who are very angry about, I don't know, say Saudi Arabia, the bombing of Yemen, which is a terrible humanitarian crisis, the approach of MBS to his own citizens, the longstanding discriminatory policies against women. But you don't say, I hate Saudi, I hate Saudi Arabia and we need more minorities, but also don't discriminate against Muslims in America. We don't say that. We just say, don't discriminate against Muslims and stop Islamophobia. So I think when Jewish people, whether it's Bret Stephens or Jonathan Greenblatt, anyone in between, when we say you should call anti-Semitism full stop, this is what we're talking about. Now, there are some signs of hope. Although I think from an institutional basis, we've seen a lack of courage among university presidents broadly. I'll point out to your counterpart at Rutgers University, who's particularly shameful and embarrassment to the academy. And I think we've seen a lack of strong statements from corporate leaders. We have seen some real signs of hope. Last week, ADL and several other Jewish groups organized a virtual rally against anti-Semitism that attracted more than 25,000 viewers. And we had statements on that virtual event from celebrities like Leslie Odom Jr. and Nick Cannon, from faith leaders from the Muslim and Catholic and Protestant communities, and from civil rights leaders like the CEO of the National Urban League, or the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is a large Latinx advocacy group, or the Asian American Foundation, the Committee of 100, a Chinese American advocacy group, or Indie Diaspora, which is a South Asian advocacy group. So we have seen statements of hope, but I think it's fair for your viewers and the general public to ask themselves, why is Jewish blood cheaper than other forms of people? And why, when we are victimized, do we not see the same clear, unambiguous denunciations? Now, I think Joe Biden did something very important with his statement, like it's at least last week. He came out strongly against it. Like, I'm not surprised it's President Biden. And we have seen some Democratic leaders and some Republican leaders clearly denounce it, but we need more of that, Jeff, and we need it now.
Jonathan, let's talk about the media as both a vector of anti-Semitism and part of the reason, perhaps, anti-Semitism is being treated differently. So the New York Times recently featured a 6-column feature on its front page of children killed in the Gaza conflict. Your predecessor at ADL, Abe Foxman, called this a blood libel, said he was canceling his subscription. Would you agree?
Well, look, I saw that front page, and I'll share with your audience that I went back and forth with A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher, because I expressed some real deep concern about that as well. You know, in the Jewish faith, we believe that if you save a life, you save the world entire. It's sort of a Talmudic phrase. Save one life, you save the world. I believe by the same token, the loss of one life is the loss of an entire world. Every person, particularly every child who died in that conflict, was a tragedy. Period. End of story. It's a deeply sad thing. Now, reality is there was a certain number, I think 60-ish, I'm not sure the exact number, of Palestinian children who died in the conflict. There were 2 Jewish children who died, Israeli Jewish children who died in the conflict. Every loss of life is a tragedy. I think what was challenging about the way that the New York Times presented that information, I think in some ways, I applaud the effort to humanize statistics to explain the lives of those lost. At the same time, the lack of effective contextualization made that piece very problematic. Number one, an estimated 1/3 of the Hamas rockets either exploded on the launch pad or fell within Gazan territory and killed people. An estimated 1/3 of those children died at the hands of Hamas rockets. You wouldn't know that from the New York Times piece. Number two, apparently the New York Times sourced that piece in part from the Hamas Information Bureau. Not exactly the AP. To the best of my recollection, the museum didn't have a collection provided by the Hamas Information Bureau. Maybe it's me, but I missed that. I missed that part of the museum. So to think that that was credible strains credulity, right? And then I think the third thing to ask, and by the way, the way the whole piece was framed, that Israel attacked Gaza, Israel did not attack Gaza. Israel responded to rockets from Gaza. The way any sovereign state on the planet Earth would respond to an onslaught of rockets from a neighboring territory. Now we can argue about, the efficacy of their approach. We can argue about the need to find ways to alleviate the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. We can argue about what more Israel could do to strengthen moderate forces in the Palestinian movement in the West Bank, let alone in Gaza. But Israel did not attack Gaza, it responded. Israel didn't kill those children, Hamas did at least a third. And Hamas itself provided that information. I think the last thing though, Jeff, that should be pointed out, and I think that all viewers, all readers have an obligation to ask themselves, how did the New York Times cover against some 60 Palestinian children, 62 children, let's say, died? How has the New York Times covered the children who've died in the Syrian civil war? Again, to put this in some context, roughly 300,000 people were murdered during the Syrian civil war. Some 300,000 people, including a large number of children. How many times did they get the front page treatment in the New York Times? How about in Yemen, which is arguably the worst humanitarian conflict in the world right now? How about any other crisis? Like how about in Sub-Saharan Africa? We've had a huge problem with child soldiers and kidnappings in places like Nigeria and Kenya. So I think some readers ask themselves, why does the New York Times focus so disproportionately on this conflict rather than all the other equally tragic humanitarian situations around the world? So again, to bring it back, I believe that any loss of life is tragic, no matter how it happens. I believe that humanizing statistics is an important part to better understand the world around us. But the New York Times failure to contextualize the information effectively, how they source that information, and the way that they approach this conflict versus all others, I think reasonably leave a lot of responsible leaders with more questions than answers.
Jonathan, thank you. I'm talking with Jonathan Greenblatt, National Director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, about the current upsurge in anti-Semitism. Please begin to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Let's move to another part of the media, John Oliver. So in a recent segment, he said, for decades, the backbone of American policy in the Middle East has been America as an unwavering friend of Israel, which is a great thing to try and be, but at the end of the day, I would hope that our real friend would tell me when I'm being an asshole, and definitely when I'm committing an effing war crime. What's the impact on the current climate of anti-Semitism of statements like that from a widely followed cable television personality?
So what I would say first, again, you said it, not me. You quoted him, not I. But here's a message to the audience. John Oliver, as your friend, let me tell you, you're being a bleep if you watch John Oliver's piece, it's clarifying in as much as he's clearly not Walter Cronkite, or even like, an evening anchor on late night cable news. I don't think he could get the overnight shift, because his piece was so chock full of misinformation. And one of the things that he went on a great length about saying the fact that the lack of symmetry in the conflict shows you that Israel is wrong. John Oliver, not exactly a student of history. I don't think he got his PhD in history from the AJU. So I don't think his thesis would fly. But to get back to your question, I do think that, again, I do think that baseless allegations and unsubstantiated claims and repeating conspiracy theories create a climate in which unhinged people will respond. It's no different than people espousing QAnon and then acting on it. When you espouse things like it's some entirely one-sided conflict and it's a huge injustice, that's all the doing of only one party, then of course it will inspire people who don't exactly, dwell in facts to feel it can create the conditions which they feel compelled to act on that. So I think whether it's John Oliver or Trevor Noah or Bella Hadid, these influencers need to realize that they do no justice to their cause, and in fact only perpetrate injustice when they fail to effectively offer balanced views of what's actually happening in a very complex part of the world. Their tendency to oversimplify, Jeff, I think their tendency to oversimplify leads to actually a lack of understanding rather than any real moral clarity.
Jonathan, I'll change the order of my questions because I think that's an important point. You tweeted out an op-ed by our mutual friend, Rabbi David Wolpe, a beautiful op-ed in the New York Times about Jews' 3,000-year-old relationship with Israel and why that made the current conflict so complicated. And it was, as one would expect from Rabbi Wolpe, a lovely essay. And I thought two things when I read that essay. One, that this really is a beautiful statement about Jews' long-term relationship with Israel. And second, was this going to win the battle against anti-Semitism, or did we have to descend to the gutter like John Oliver?
Well, so a few things. It was a lovely essay, and I was a longtime congregant of Rabbi Wolpe at Sinai Temple. And his books are wonderful, and his sermons are inspiring, and so it was no surprise to see him do this here. I think part of what Rabbi Wolpe was getting at with that essay was, it's complicated. We've been there a long time, and like to deny the the Jewish connection to Jerusalem or to Eretz Yisrael is doing everyone a disservice. In the world we live in today, our young people, and a lot of the population, they don't get their news anymore from the Times or from TV. They get it from TikTok and Twitter. And those mediums don't lend themselves to nuance. But the reality is, the world is nuanced. History is not one-dimensional, captured effectively in a Vine video. You need to take time to breathe in and make sense of these really complicated matters. So I think that, look at ADL, we're pretty black and white about fighting hate, if you will. But we appreciate that you need to take a nuanced approach on the issues. You just do. And I think even here as well, like I said before, I think if you really are a champion of Zionism, and I am a proud and unapologetic Zionist, you also have to stand for Palestinian rights. I don't know how you can divorce these things, because the best way, I believe, like many other people, for Israel to maintain its status as a Jewish and democratic state and a homeland for the Jewish people is to ensure that its Palestinian neighbor also has dignity and equality and the kind of stability that those people deserve, the descendants of refugees and whatnot, who also have a deep and abiding connection to the land. So it's nuanced, Jeff, and it might not work well in a John Oliver skewed monologue. It might not work well, in a single tweet. It's much easier to post to Instagram some hysterical meme, right? It'll drive much more clicks when you make up some claim about Israel. But I don't think we will ever descend into the kind of trivialization that these folks engage in, because I don't think in the short run, it might drive more clicks. But in the long run, I think it diminishes the public conversation, and we all end up losing.
Jonathan, ADL has been working for quite some time on social media. You called for a temporary advertiser boycott of Facebook last year. You excoriated Facebook in a recent letter to its newly established board. But you've also been very critical of Twitter during the current surge, noting 17,000 tweets of Heil Hitler in seemingly a few hours, as well as you just mentioned, TikTok, not an American company. So the discussion now about hate on social media is not a new one. ADL and others have been talking about it for years. Companies have been making promises for years, but it seems that nonetheless, they were really powerful vectors of anti-Semitism during the current conflict. Not much has improved. Maybe it's gotten much worse. Is that your thought? And what's going to be your approach to these major companies, including TikTok, in the future?
So we're in touch with the leadership at TikTok and Twitter and Google Search, YouTube, other parts of the company, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. I mean, we talk to all these giants. We do so, let alone newer platforms like Clubhouse and Substack. We talk to them because we have to. We believe that the front line in fighting hate today is really on Facebook, Jeff. That's why in 2017, ADL opened our Center for Technology and Society in Silicon Valley. That's why we did that. And so, indeed, we work with the companies because I think the pace of innovation is so great. We've got to engage these businesses, try to help them understand how getting their arms around hate is not just an issue for stakeholders like ADL, it's an issue for their shareholders. Ultimately, their products will perform more effectively when their users feel safe and secure, and they'll deliver better results. We've had some success. I mean, that campaign that we launched last summer with the NAACP and other groups, Stop Hate for Profit, ultimately led Facebook to make a series of concessions, like finally classifying Holocaust denialism as hate speech. And yet Facebook isn't doing nearly enough to implement their promises. And we just, I just released a report yesterday. You may have seen it. It's on adl.org, calling them out for this very issue. Maybe someone can put it in the chat if people are interested, or the Q&A. At the same time, they got to do more. I mean, you mentioned, and we saw during the conflict, this hashtag Hitler was right, trending on Twitter more than 17,000 times. We worked with Twitter to get that hashtag taken down, and they did it. And then new ones showed up that were derivative of that, like Hitler is right or stuff. But it's a constant game of whack-a-mole. And where I end up landing on this, Jeff, and we may or may not even be eye to eye on this, but look, I would tell you and our viewers today that the social media companies shouldn't be able to defy gravity and escape the same responsibility that's appropriate to all other media businesses. So there's a law in place called Section 230, which exempts from liability companies that have platforms that have user-generated content, right? Whereas the New York Times or CNN has kind of a whole set of protocols, from standards and practices to editorial boards to ombudsmen to fact checkers, to ensure that, again, they don't post things that are untrue. With Facebook, the algorithms are designed to promote to amplify what drives the most engagement. And so often, as we know from local news, if it bleeds, it leads. So indeed, the ADL is focused on not only working with the companies, holding them accountable, and using reputational pressure like I did with Facebook where we need to. We're also at ADL building technology. I have engineers with expertise in artificial intelligence and natural language processing who work at ADL now, because we're building the tech so we can measure them and hold them accountable more effectively, not just anecdotally, but empirically. And then thirdly, I think we've really got to, beyond just our own R&D, we've got to engage and explore policy interventions. I mean, the reality is, if these platforms just enforce their own terms of service, it would do us all well, because all their terms of service say hate speech isn't allowed, and yet they do allow it. And sometimes, like at Facebook, they allow it under the guise of First Amendment. But the First Amendment doesn't apply to corporations. You can't walk into a Starbucks and scream at all the other customers, all Mexicans go home. If you walk into a Starbucks and scream at the customers, The Starbucks manager will throw you out. And the New York Times doesn't have to print every letter to the editor. They get to choose. So could Facebook and Twitter and Google do exactly the same thing. Because again, it's not freedom of expression when you're inciting violence against people. It's not freedom of speech when you're slandering minorities. And so I think we need legislative and policy strategy now, Jeff, to curb the tendencies of these companies and get them more in line with reality.
Jonathan, but why haven't the companies, after what has now already been a long discussion, which portray themselves and certainly have employees, which are very progressive. These are companies with unlimited resources, seemingly, far more engineers than anyone else. Why is it they're actually unable to deal with these problems, or they're unwilling to?
So first of all, it's not a lack of skill. I think it's a lack of will. I mean, you know, it's hard. I mean, I've had these conversations with the management of these companies, with the CEOs and whatnot. Like, and I know Facebook pretty well, and there's some really good, hardworking, decent people who want to do the right thing. But you know what's hard? Build a business that generates $80 billion a year in revenue and attracts 3.5 billion users. That's hard. I'm sorry, it's 2.5 billion. That's hard. That's larger than any civilization in the history of the human race. That's pretty hard. You know what's not so hard? Knocking Nazis off the platform. That's not so difficult. I think if the companies were deeply committed to it, they could do it. But the reality is that in a buoyant stock market, their share price hasn't been punished. Again, EPS and engagement are what's valued, right? Not keeping your users safe and secure. And without any legal liability or effective policy oversight, they can do what they want. So I think this is why we need to bring to bear new pressures, both reputational and regulatory pressure, to help these companies curb their tendencies. But to be clear, Jeff, this is a cultural issue. I mean, Silicon Valley is very libertarian. You know, Facebook was built and the motto was go fast and break things, not keep your users safe. And so when your model is go fast and break things, what do you think happens? Things break. And so the companies and their business models were designed around advertising. Again, maximize clicks, optimize engagement, really almost engender addiction and a kind of dependency. It wasn't built around make sure that, you know, users of color, make sure that indigenous people, make sure that religious minorities feel protected. And again, without any legal recourse, there's no reason for them to change. Without any legal recourse or financial pressures, there's very little reason for them to change. That's why we need an intervention. I think unless it comes from Washington or from Brussels, we're going to continue to see this problematic behavior persist.
Jonathan, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience. Thank you, audience. And let me get to some of them.
Okay.
One of our audience members writes, with the end of Trump, shouldn't we have expected these incidents and statistics to improve?
Well, look, hate is bigger than any one person. Anti-Semitism and intolerance existed before Donald Trump. Don't be surprised it persists after. And again, he may have been a locus for many people. And again, from his conspiratorial claims about the election to xenophobic comments about Asians and other blank countries, to his policies toward children at the border, I could go on with the numbers things that I think that he did that were wrong. But again, hate existed before him and it will persist after. And I think what's really critical for all the audience to know, when we talk about calling hate, we have to have the courage to not just call it out when when your opponents are guilty, but also when your allies are responsible. So it meant so much when after January the 6th, even before January 6th, when people like Adam Kinzinger and Mitt Romney spoke out against Trump's rantings, and after Charlottesville, August 2017, Trump equivocated, but Paul Ryan didn't. Speaker Ryan spoke out immediately. Leader McConnell spoke out immediately. Senator Romney spoke out immediately. People on the conservative side, Republicans, called out the Republican president. By the same token, we need progressives and people on the Democratic side to call out Democrats. So, when it's comments by Congresswoman Omar about it's all about the Benjamins, or it's, again, unhinged statements about that Israel's committing genocide, if people on the left won't call out others on the left, the way we expect people on the right to call out others on the right, then we're all doomed. I think we have to be accountable to ourselves and willing to live by our principles, not just by partisanship, particularly in these difficult times.
Jonathan, another audience member writes, we have a very well-informed audience. 150 left-wing groups last year formed a coalition called Drop the ADL, designed to exclude your organization from social justice movements. The question continues on for a bit, but the gist of it is, how much did that worry you? And did you view it as an attempt to marginalize Jews from a traditional spot they've occupied in the political spectrum?
It's a really good question, a complicated question. Look, I will say, per my just previous answer, we're living in a time when people see things through an incredibly partisan lens. And we're living in these very polarized moments. And people feel like you have to pick a side. You're on the left or you're on the right. And there's often not a lot of appetite for people who are, I don't want to say morally in the middle, but who are unwilling to commit to some ideological corner. ADL is Exhibit A. I'm routinely criticized by people on the right, maybe some in the Q&A, I don't know, who think I'm too liberal, too progressive, tilting ADL to the left. And I'm also routinely criticized by people on the left who think I'm too conservative, too Paleolithic, tilting ADL to the right. So you can read criticisms of my leadership and of our organization in left-wing outlets and in right-wing outlets, and they're almost the photo negative of one another. I try not to pay it too much attention. This campaign, the Drop the ADL campaign, indeed, I think is an effort to marginalize the ADL because of our long-standing, success as fighting for civil rights issues and doing it in a principled, but not political way. The reality is that I'm proud of our partnerships with the Urban League and the NAACP and LULAC and UNIDOS and so many other great organizations. That hasn't changed since these marginal groups make these unfounded claims. And we're going to keep doing the work. That doesn't mean we're perfect. ADL is far from perfect. We've had our fair share of missteps and mistakes. That's what happens when you've been around for over 100 years. But from our legacy of fighting for civil rights in the 1940s, for anyone involved in these groups or even alive, to where we are today, again, standing up for immigrant children or for Black Americans, I'm proud of what we've accomplished. And we're going to continue to do the work and allow our critics to do what they do on the sidelines as armchair quarterbacks. That's a lovely place to be. I don't have time to spend giving them too much, bandwidth.
Jonathan, we're almost out of time. Let me ask you two final questions.
That was like fast. Jeff, that was so fast.
You are welcome back anytime, but I know you have a lot to do. So I want to be very conscious of your time.
That's okay.
But let me ask you first. If we were to go back on this platform in a year or so, and I hope we would, and you said, wow, the societal response to the rise in anti-Semitism starting in June of 2021 was actually very impressive and tamped down what could have been an explosive moment. What would have been the steps that you would have thought most important?
Good question. So a few things. Number one, leaders leading. Whether you're the president of the United States, or you're the president of a university, you're the president of your local school board, stepping up and speaking out without conditions, without qualifications, and condemning anti-Semitism as clearly and cogently as you condemn other forms of hate. And particularly people doing it when it happens, if you will, from their ideological, bench. That's number one. Number two, we would have seen, I think relatedly from a policy perspective, in particular, I worry a lot about universities. where I think we've had a problem where university presidents and kind of the ivory tower more generally has allowed kind of an anti-Israelism to fester that's become anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Look, I think there's plenty of opportunity in a college seminar on 19th century theories of nationalism to come out strongly against Zionism. And I also think, by the way, like if you're a refugee from, I don't know, or your family's in Nablus, I don't expect you to march in the Israel Day parade, don't get me wrong. But so often as we see at these rallies that have been happening over the last few weeks, the equation of Zionism and Nazism, the hateful displays of anti-Zionism, it spawns anti-Semitism through and through. And I can give you a list as long as my arm of examples that bear that out to be the case. So I think if we saw universities tighten that up, I think that would also be very important. To be clear, not to stop free speech, to be clear, not to stifle debates about Middle East policies, but to make sure they happen in a respectful, fact-based way that don't encourage, inflammatory rhetoric, which leads to inflammatory actions. I think number three, social media needs to really move far, far forward from where they are. And finally you can imagine in a year, if the social media companies held a summit, they agreed to take a series of steps together, collaboratively, in concert with maybe activist groups like the ADL and others, to finally halt the hate speech that's so prevalent on their platforms, maybe to share information about effective algorithms and AI strategies, that also might go a really long way. So to bring it back, leaders leading, a focus on campus, and social media finally moving the ball downfield. Those might be three things that I think could have a dispositive impact on this issue.
Jonathan, final question, which sums up many of the questions of our audience. What would be the most important thing that you believe that people, Jews especially, but anyone concerned about the surge in anti-Semitism could do? I know, of course, you want them to support the ADL, and that's important, but I think many individuals feel bewildered about what to do about a series of events which seems to be spinning out of control. What's your advice?
That's a good question. I wouldn't, look, I'm delighted if people generally, if your audience, they specifically decides to support the ADL, but they don't have to. There are a lot of great groups who are involved in this work. Federations do important work. There's lots of great organizations that do it. We have a heuristic at ADL that we use to talk about the role of individuals. It's speak up, share facts, show strength. So what can you do as an individual? Number one, speak up. When hate happens, you've got to intervene. You've got to engage. You can't cower. You can't say it's not my issue, so I don't care. Anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian hate. You've got to have, again, I think the ability to insert yourself, whether it's, at the proverbial water cooler at work, or it's at the family, dinner table, or even, like on your wall, on your Facebook page, right? Or in Twitter. Speak up, say something. Don't be a bystander, be an upstander, okay? When it's you're affected or someone else. That's number one. Speak up. Number two, share facts. Don't engage in hyperbole or hysteria. Don't share that, inflammatory email from your mother-in-law's neighbor's, niece that makes some crazy claim. Don't do that. Don't do that. Like, get literate, read up, and focus on facts. We're very oriented on ADL around data and empiricism, not on crazy claims. And I just think we've all got to turn down the dial a little bit. So again, when you engage, share facts. And then thirdly, show strength. Like I've heard stories about people saying, I'm afraid to wear my kippah, which I get, I understand, but I totally disagree with it. You've got to be bold. And showing strength means feeling confident about standing up for allies, by the way, and then asking those allies to stand up for you. Showing strength means leaning into your Jewish identity, not leaning back. Being willing to take the blows, the metaphorical blows, if you will. And it also means showing strength, like, look, There's a federal program, nonprofit security grants, that allows you to get funding for synagogues or schools or JCCs or maybe even like an AJU to make sure the institutions are effectively protected. Go for that. There's no reason not to. Strength means defending yourself and also being on offense. And again, it's about being not just an upstander, but an instander and driving on things rather than leaning back. So what can you do as an individual? Speak up, share facts, show strength. Do it with pride and with purpose, and don't allow the bigots and the extremists and the intolerant to intimidate or terrorize you. Don't let them win. We have this expression, right? Am Yisrael Chai, and I think it's never been more true now. And so I would remember that at all times, and I think it will serve you well.
Jonathan Greenblatt, National Director and CEO of the ADL, thank you so much. Thanks for your time and for your insights and for your wisdom.
Thanks for all your good work at AJU, and thank you for having me.
And I'd like to thank the audience also. Thanks for joining us for today's program on B'Yachad Together, spirited by AJU. And visit our website, www.aju.edu often to see the many exciting programs which are coming up. Thank you, Jonathan. Good luck with all the work.
Thank you.